right. We are going to read in 2 Corinthians 1, starting in verse 3. Praise be to the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the suffering of Christ, we also share our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. And if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces a patient endurance of the same suffering we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our comfort. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the trouble we experience in the province of Asia. We are under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we received the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivers us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us.
All right. Thank you so much, Bree. Great job. Well, hey, welcome. I'm so glad to see your faces. For the last number of months, I've been watching as your face popped up on the live stream, and you didn't know it, but I was waving to you vigorously as that happened. And so I do want to say welcome. Some of you are joining us for the first time in person. Man, we're so honored and thrilled to have you. And maybe some of you are still watching us online and you're waiting for that moment. We understand. We imagine over the next few weeks we'll see more and more of the regular folks that we've met before making their way back in, but we'll also see the faces of people who've joined us during this season of online only. And so we want to welcome all of you as part of the family. We're glad, so glad that you're here. In fact, I don't know if you guys realize this, but there's always like a 45-second delay between what's happening in here live and what's happening online. And so I stopped in our overflow room and I was greeting people in there just now. And then I realized, oh my goodness, what's happening on the screen is not live. So if I'm out of breath, I was running to get back up here because I realized I had no idea what time it was. So thank you for joining us. We're so glad. And I pray that today is just fills you with hope and encouragement, but with something that's solid and real. And so I know that our world is just in a tough place right now for many numbers of reasons. But I truly believe that God is big enough and then some. And so as we gather today, we're going to give you some solid answers. We're going to start a whole new series. Has anyone here ever been accused of being hard-headed? Go ahead and raise your hand. See, if you were really hard-headed, you wouldn't have raised your hand. But anyway, someone else raised their hand for you. You're truly one of the hardheads. And so anyway, I've been accused of being hard-headed. And I know that even when it comes to spiritual matters in my life, I'm hard-headed. Like I'm slow to learn. Have you ever run into the same problem again and again? And you'd say, if I just didn't do this wouldn't happen. I wouldn't find myself. And so then what do? This, right? And so you just do it again. Like, maybe it'll be different this time. I know this has happened 150 times the same way, but I know it'll be different. And so the truth is all of us struggle with it. And so we're going to start this new series from the book of 2 Corinthians. And it was written by a guy named Paul a couple thousand years ago. And Paul was a follower of Jesus who came to Jesus in kind of a hard-headed way. He originally was persecuting, jailing, and even overseeing the execution of some of the early church leaders. And then through the process of God and his mercy, Paul met Jesus, and then he began to help lead the church. And so Paul spent the second half of his life traveling his known world. He traveled all over Europe and Asia, and he'd show up in a city and he'd just set up roots and start meeting people, and he would just start a church where one didn't exist. He would talk to people about Jesus, they would form a group, and he would disciple those people, and then over the course of time, he would pick a leader, and he would begin to train that leader. And so then when he would leave, sometimes after 6 months, sometimes after a couple of years, he would leave this young pastor in charge of the church. And then he would continue to move on to other cities, establishing other churches. And then he would write letters to the churches that he had established. And that's where we get so much of the New Testament. That's books like Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians. All of these are letters that Paul wrote to these churches that he started. So one in particular that he started was named Corinth. It was the city of Corinth. He started a church there. And Corinth is kind of recognized by Bible scholars as like the black sheep church. So this was the church that had all the problems. And so this was the church that had unusual amounts of sin going on, just terrible things, like things that you can't even imagine being on a soap opera. They were happening in the Corinthian church. And then there was problems with leadership, there was issues, there was dissension and all of that. And so Paul hears about all this stuff going on in this church that he loves. And so he writes a letter to them. And this letter is kind of strong. It's got a lot of correction in it. It's saying, listen, you shouldn't do this, you should do that. And that letter is called 1 Corinthians, okay? And he was writing it to Corinth. So again, they weren't very creative with names back then. But anyway, and so he writes 1 Corinthians to Corinth, and then he waits and he thinks, they're going to get it. These people, they're sharp. I remember them. They're incredible. And so he gives it a little time. And he's going to this other city to start a church there, but he thinks on the way to this other city, I'm stopping and visiting all my friends in Corinth, and I can't wait to see how they've implemented all these things I wrote them about in my letter. He gets there and he realizes not only have they not implemented the changes in the letter, they've gotten worse, right? So these guys didn't move in the right direction. They moved in the wrong direction. So he's bummed out. He spends some time there kind of teaching and counteracting some of the bad things. And then he says, okay, here's the plan, guys. Now that you've learned all this stuff, I know you want to be, I'm going to go ahead to this other city, start a church there. When I'm done and traveling in, I'm going to come back through and I'm going to see you again because I want to see what it's like after you guys have implemented all this great stuff. So time goes by, he does all that, and he begins to get word through friends that not only, again, has Corinth not moved in the right direction, they've continued to move in the wrong direction. And so Paul has a problem. He's like, the last time I visited them, it was somewhat unpleasant. I had to be corrective. I had to have that fatherly tone. I want to just go and celebrate with them. So he has an idea. Rather than visiting in person this time, I'm going to send a second letter. So that's the book of 2 Corinthians. The letter, it's his second attempt. So now it's his third correction. He wrote them a letter, he visited them in person, and now he's written them another letter. Because his heart was that I really want you guys to get this so that when I see you in person again, we don't have to talk about unpleasant things. We can celebrate together. We can be excited. And so even though this book is full of some confrontational ideas, it just highlights the great mercy and love of God. Because 3 times God's people in this specific church didn't get it. And God doesn't send lightning bolts. God doesn't send a plague. God doesn't send any of these things to come and chastise them in love and in correction. God writes a letter from a friend to address the issue. And so the book of 2 Corinthians really is good news for hard heads. It's a church that really should have gotten it by now. Like they really should have gotten it together, but they just haven't. And so God, in grace, circles back around and takes time again. And so I want you to see this. When we're in a time in society where we're realizing, maybe for the first time, maybe we're being reminded that some of us just don't get it, right? And maybe there's things that have happened in your life that remind you that, man, I just don't get it. And so I'm so excited to start this study together where it shows us God's posture, because I know that when I blow it and I have those moments where I realize, man, I don't get it, I'm tempted to be hard on myself. I'm tempted to feel like God's probably fed up. God's probably ready. He's got the lightning bolt locked and loaded, right? And the truth is, that's how society treats us, right? Like maybe you are in this time as a person realizing that there's a lot of things when it comes to racial, harmony that you just haven't gotten. And you go, hey, you know what? I don't get it. And it's so good to see that God is not like this and he's not like this, but in love and kindness, he circles back around to take time with us and to walk us towards wholeness. And so that's what 2 Corinthians is. And so there's so much that we can learn together from this church that's a couple thousand years old, right? Because if you're like me, even though you've been serving Jesus for a while, or maybe you're brand new at this, but you look at your life and you go, there's a lot of things that I know I shouldn't be doing that I am doing. And some of you look at your life and you go, there's a lot of good things that I know I should be doing that I'm not doing. And maybe you're beginning to recognize that there's a lot of gross things living in your heart that aren't even doing things, they're thinking things, they're feeling things. And you realize, man, I'm pretty messed up. Right? Or maybe you've been a Christian for a while and you've come to realize, you know what? When it comes to people are like, what does God's word say about this or about that? You realize, man, I think I can quote more sitcoms than I can Bible verses, right? Like, I think I can quote The Office or Parks and Rec better than I can quote the Bible sometimes. And maybe you're coming to realize, man, I'm culturally rich, but biblically poor. And so the book of 2 Corinthians is for people just like us. People who probably should get it a little more than they do by now, but just don't. But in mercy and grace, God circles around for us. And so I'm excited to jump into this. I know Bree read through the whole section that we're going to cover today, but I want to zoom in on a verse where we're going to start. So 2 Corinthians chapter 1, we're going to read verses 8 and 9. It'll be on the screens. It says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself." Catch that for a second. This is the Apostle Paul, man of faith, man of power, man of vision, right? And he's saying, man, we despaired. We didn't even want to be alive. Verse 9, "Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death." So that brings us to the first idea I want to talk about, guys. We may encounter hardship that's beyond our ability to endure, and situations that are beyond our ability to navigate. Like, did I hear that right? Because I thought we were coming here this morning for some encouragement, right? This doesn't sound like a fortune cookie. Guess what? You're going to encounter situations that are beyond your ability to endure. You're going to encounter things that you don't know how to navigate. And I don't know about you, but all my life, I've grown up kind of going to church since I was about 6 years old. And all my life, both non-Christian people, non-church people, and then also church people, I've heard this refrain over and over again. When hard things happen, whether you're going through something or you're telling something hard, when hard things are happening, I've heard people say this to me: God doesn't give us more than we can what? Handle. Right? Haven't you heard that? It's almost like, and they say, well, you know, Bob, God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Or maybe you sound a little more holy and say, bear, God doesn't give us more than we can bear, right? Whatever it is. And we know that God doesn't give us more than we can handle. How many of you guys have ever heard that and you're like, man, I didn't get that memo? Because that's like, this seems to be more than I can handle right now, right? And so we've been told that, but the funny thing is, if you read Paul's words, he said, man, I felt like I'd received a death sentence. It was so hard, I despaired of life itself. What he's saying is, if I'd had the choice, I would have chose to be dead rather than going through what I went through. So I don't want to interpret that verse too much for you. I'll let you do that. But to me, that sounds like he had more than he could handle. I don't know the official definition of more than you can handle, but I feel like I've received a death sentence and I would rather be dead than walk through this. That sounds like more than you can handle, right? And so it's according to Paul, God did give him more than he can handle. So the question I want to ask is, where did we get this idea that God won't give you more than you can handle? Where did that come from? Because we say it like we're quoting a Bible verse. We say, well, we know that God won't give you more than we can. And it's one of those things that I think, now I can't say where everyone got their crazy ideas, but I think it comes from a Bible verse that we've slightly misread. And so the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says that no temptation has taken you except that which is common to man. And God is faithful, and he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear, beyond what you can handle. And then it goes on to say, and with the temptation, he'll make a way of escape so that you can stand up under it. And so what that verse is actually telling us is that when it comes to temptation to sin, God will not allow any individual temptation in your life to be completely unavoidable. He won't allow it to be inevitable for you to sin in that situation. That's what it's saying. It's saying that any temptation that comes to you is something that if you do it right, you're able to resist. It's saying that God will make this little escape hatch. How many of you guys have ever done something wrong and you saw the escape hatch and you just chose to ignore the escape hatch, right? You're like, you start into a conversation and you're going to tell somebody something about someone else that you shouldn't share, you shouldn't say, and in that moment your cell phone rings and stops you and you answer it and you're like, as you're talking, you're like, I know this is God stopping me from talking about somebody I shouldn't talk about. And then as soon as you hang up, you're like, let me get back to what I was saying, right? And so so we have these escape hatches, but we often choose just to kind of leave them unaddressed. And so what this verse is talking about is not hardship, it's temptation. It's saying, listen, there is nothing that's going to be completely impossible for you to avoid, right? So this isn't talking about hardship. This isn't talking about hardship. So then the God will not give you more than you can handle thing is not biblical truth. It's actually just one of those pleasant sounding cliches, okay? How many of you guys have ever said a cliche, right? I mean, is it cliche to even say cliche? But anyway, and so it's a cliche. It's something that sounds nice that we say to people when we have no idea what else to say. That's a cliche. It's like, I know I should say something. This feels uncomfortable. Let me say something, right? And we just say something that sounds nice, right? And so this is one of those pleasant sounding cliches. And here's the truth, right? How many of you guys have ever really suffered, gone through something hard, and someone told you a cliche? Was that like a super helpful moment for you? No. Right? Usually you're like, I've got the Old Testament gift of judgment that's coming down on you right now. You just want to slap people. You're like, no, that's not helpful. Right? But here's the thing. Paul isn't dealing in cliche here. He's dealing in truth. He's dealing in reality. And so speaking of reality, Paul, he doesn't hide from the reality of what he experienced. He doesn't like dress it up or doll it up. He doesn't try to make it sound better than it was. He doesn't downplay it, right? Like, how many of you guys ever seen someone downplay something? Like, you know something really bad happened and you like said, hey, I'm really sorry about blank. And then they didn't really want to talk about it, so they downplayed it. Like, in the first service, I just made up a dumb example. It's like someone loses their arm in an accident. You're like, I'm so sorry that you lost your arm. That's terrible. And they say, well, it turns out I'd already lost the glove for that hand anyway, so it's good because now I don't have to replace that glove, right? Obviously, that's a joke, but that's what we do is we downplay it. We minimize it, and Paul is not doing that. He's not downplaying. He's not dressing it up. He says, listen, we thought we were dead for sure. Like this situation was so hard, we thought we were going to die. And for those of you who've read a lot of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul almost died a lot. Okay? And so if you hang around a lot, I'll tell you a lot of dumb stories. If you keep coming, I did a lot of dumb stuff as a kid, and I'm still a kid. And so there's a lot of things that happen that I've just kind of, broken myself in ways that come with being dumb. But the Apostle Paul, his factors are way up here. His stories, if you read, like the dude was shipwrecked because he traveled from place to place starting churches. He was shipwrecked multiple times. One time, he tells us that he was adrift, bobbing up and down in the ocean for an entire day and an entire night. Like, he wants to make sure it's like, it wasn't just 12 hours. It was a day and a night. I was doing the doggy paddle in the middle of the ocean, okay? That's serious stuff. Right? You know how Jesus was beaten with the cat of nine tails? It's the 40 lashes minus 139 lashes with a whip with 9 things on it, right? That happened to Paul multiple times. In fact, there was this one city he went into to start a church, and he started preaching, and the people drug him out of the city, and they stoned him. They threw giant stones at him until they thought he was dead. And then he kind of came to, and I guess he wasn't dead, and he dug his way out from the pile of rocks, and he walked right back into the city they just drug him out of. He was beaten with canes. There was one time where his life was threatened, and they had to wait till night when the city gates were shut, and then someone put him in a bucket and tied a rope to the bucket and lowered him down outside the city wall so he could escape. There was another time where 49 men dedicated themselves. They promised, I'm not going to eat food again until I murder Paul. This guy had it rough, okay? And so with having said all of that, he tells us all those stories. Whatever happened to him in the province of Asia, he didn't even explain and tell us. He was like, I don't even really want to get into that. That's bad news. I'm just going to tell you it was hard. So going through all that he went through, whatever he went through in Asia that he's describing was so bad that it makes all this other stuff look like nothing. And so he's like, it was seriously bad. And so I want you to understand, Paul doesn't like immediately try to spin this or reframe it in a positive light and say, you know what, God never gives us more than we can handle. I wish he just didn't have so much confidence in me, right? And so he doesn't do any of that. He lets it be what it is. And in fact, when he says that we despaired of life itself, he's saying, listen, if I had known what I was getting into before I got into it and been given the choice, do you want to stay alive and do this, or do you want to die? He says, I would have chosen to die instead of going through that. And so I just want to be really transparent this morning and say, listen, we will encounter situations in life that are simply beyond our capacity. And Paul shows us that. And I want you to know, as a Christian, it's not a lack of faith to say, I'm in over my head. Like, I don't know how I'm going to go through this. It's not a lack of spirituality to say, this is so hard, I don't know what to do next. I don't know how I can do this. But so often as Christians, we can't handle long periods of discomfort because we feel like then we don't have faith. And so we immediately try to cheer people up who are still in the middle of the storm. And so in Romans 12:15, it actually tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice, but to mourn with those who mourn. Right? So when we look at someone and they're going through it, you don't have to think about what it looks like on the bright side. You can say, you know what, man, that really is terrible. I'm so sorry. I don't know what you're going to do either, but I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to check in on you. I'm going to keep up with you. Right? It's not a lack of faith in that moment to let that be what it is. Right? And so I want to just talk about reality. There's a lot going on in society between COVID-19 and financial fallout, mass unemployment. There's racial injustice. There's civil unrest. And then there's political bickering. It's like rather than fixing problems so often, we get people that just want to argue about problems. And so we may be looking at life and saying, man, I don't know how to navigate this. Right? I mean, I'll be honest and say, I look at what's going on in society. One thing I know is that I don't know. Right? I don't know how to navigate this. But I'll be quick to say, listen, I don't get it. Please teach me. God, please show us the way forward. This is too much for me in my own ability. But even more than societal problems, there's personal problems. Like maybe you're facing or have faced or will face a disease that could claim your life or seriously disrupt it. Like maybe you struggle with mental illness. And I mean, just imagine. Some of you, you don't have to imagine, but some of us do have to imagine what it's like to not be able to trust what comes in through our senses. To know that what's up here isn't working right. It seems like it's too much to handle from my perspective. Maybe your family has exploded. Maybe your marriage is broken. Maybe everything that you've come to count on is just falling apart in your hands and you don't know how to proceed. You're broken-hearted. You're bewildered. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Like something that seemed completely unimaginable, that God would never let you go through this. But you find yourself having gone through it. Like maybe somehow you invited the demon of addiction into your life. And now you don't know how you're ever going to get control back. You see, there's so many ways that we come up against things that are just so big. And Paul, this guy who was such a spiritual giant, the guy started, some scholars think he started as many as 27 churches by himself. Nobody says it's less than 20. Right? He wrote over a third of the New Testament. This guy who is a spiritual giant tells us about a season of life where he said, I didn't even think we were going to live through it. And to be really honest with you, I didn't want to. So first and foremost, I want to say that's real. Because so often we don't have people slow down enough to just acknowledge what we're going through is real and that it's something. That's real. And second, it's okay to be a person of faith and reach that point. So often when we reach that point, we immediately think there's something wrong with me, don't we? God, I must have done something wrong. Maybe you're punishing me for sin. Maybe you're trying, whatever it is, right? But it's okay to get to that point. It doesn't mean that you're not a person of faith. And it doesn't mean that you're demonstrating a lack of faith to talk about your circumstance for what it really is. So I want to be really clear about ability and inability. Your perceived inability may be accurate. Like you might have the right view. When you look at it and go, it looks like I can't handle this. Your perception may be reality. This may be more than you have the ability to deal with. But I've got good news because the story doesn't end there. And Paul told it, and he took his time telling it every step of the way up until this point. Yes, terrible, 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 but it doesn't end there. In verse 9 and 10, he says, but. I love whenever you read but, right? It's like everything that was just said, get ready, right? But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. I want to take a minute there. You see, the truth is, I don't care how long you've served Jesus. I've been at this a little while, not as long as many of you. But you know what we still do? We start every day relying on us. And there's very few things that can get us to let go of our own self-reliance. Our own ideas, our own abilities, our own perceptions. We usually have to run into something that we can't do before we ever begin to look outside of ourselves. How many of you guys have caught, you haven't caught yourself, but now I'm going to catch you. How many of you have ever said in a conversation with someone else, all we can do now is pray? Which means up until now, I was my own solution. But turns out all those things didn't work. So all we can do now is pray. And so that's the process Paul is describing too when he says, but this happens so we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such deadly peril, and I love this, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope. So he's saying, listen, don't be ignorant. I did go through this horrible stuff, but it felt like he raised me from the dead. And so the one who did that in that situation, he'll do that again. And so now I've learned completely, or really honestly, we learned this lesson over and over again. This isn't a one-off. So I learned again to put my hope and my trust completely in him. So guys, once we exhaust hope in our own ability, we may actually begin to put our hope in God. You kind of have to exhaust your own ability. You know, Karen and I years ago, we went rock climbing on a date, right? This is something just so that you guys know, if you're not married yet, do this after you're married, because the things you'll learn about each other during this process are very... Anyway, and so I thought I was pretty fit, doing pretty good rock climber, because I was a youth pastor at the time. We would take our students all the time to go to those indoor rock climbing gyms, and I'd always been to the ones where you have a person who's, I think you guys know what it means to belay. There's a rope tied to you, and then they tie it to someone heavier so that you can't fall. And so they pull and they pull, and there's always pressure on that rope from the belay person, and so that you know you're safe. You can feel the pressure on your belay rope on your harness. But for the first time, I went to this gym, and there's a picture of it. They had these things called auto belays. And so I think you guys have those small dogs, and they have a leash where the little thing goes out like a, and then you can like suck them back in. But anyway, so that's essentially what an auto belay is. It's this spring-loaded thing that goes up and down with you as you go up and down the wall. And there's very little resistance at all. You don't even hardly feel it. And it only kicks in and catches you after you fall, right? So there's no pressure until you've fallen a couple of feet. It's the fast motion and the spinning that sets the clutch, and then it catches you, right? And so that's great. You can move up and down unencumbered, but when you get to the top of the wall, you're supposed to lean back and just jump backwards off the wall. How many of you guys have ever done that? It's called rappelling, and you kind of push away, and it lets you down a little bit. You come back, you push away, it lets you down a little bit, and then 2 or 3 or 4 jumps at the most, you're on the ground. Well, here's the problem. I get up to there, and I want to feel like this thing is going to catch me before I let go with my hands. I'm kind of pulling against it. I'm like trying to jerk. I'm like, if I can just feel it catch, then I'll feel okay, right? So I'm like, come on, and I can't get it to catch. So you know what I did for 10 climbs? I climbed all the way up, touched the top, and then climbed all the way back down. Because I was waiting for it to catch before I fell, but it was waiting for me to fall before it caught. And so we were in this like standoff, and evidently I was losing. And so finally, after like 10 of these up and downs, I was so exhausted. My hands were so tired, right? I got to the top of a wall, and it was time to go back down, and I couldn't do it anymore. I was like, I'm way up in the air, and I'm like, I cannot climb back down one more time. And I could feel my fingers slipping off the rock. And I'm like, well, I guess we're going to find out if this thing works. and you know what? It worked. It caught me, right? And then I was able to do it the right way. But here's the thing. I didn't have any idea that it was going to work until I trusted it. So eventually I was so exhausted, I had to let the machine do what it did, right? I didn't have any choice. And so that I was never able to benefit from what that device could do until I was so tired that I didn't have any choice but to trust it. Guys, when you have nothing else to try, you might actually finally be in a place where you'll put all of your hope in God. And I want to tell you, just like that belay, He'll come through. He will. Right? Either you'll see Him intervene in a miraculous way. Now, I've seen that. There's been times where I didn't know what was going to happen, what we were going to do, and I was out of ideas, and I prayed, and God actually changed the situation. Right? I've shared so many stories. There was times where I had bills that we didn't know how we were going to pay, and then out of the blue, some crazy person walked up to me with an envelope and says, "I was praying the other day. I felt like you might need this." And I'm like, "What?" And so anyway, and it was just can't. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, and so God came through. But then there were times where rather than fixing the circumstance, I would be so tired, so at the end of my rope, and I pray and I wait, and all of a sudden from nowhere, there's this second wind. There's this ability, there's this strength, there's this clarity to go on. And I realize in that moment, I haven't tapped into my own strength, but into God's. And that's actually what Paul was describing. I think whatever happened to him in Asia, God didn't respond by changing the circumstances. He responded by breathing fresh life into Paul. He said, "Listen, I felt like I'd been given a death sentence, like in here. There was nothing left for me to give. There was nowhere left for me to go. And then the God who raises the dead did something in here that was akin to a resurrection. And then I was able to go on. I was able to trust. I had a renewed strength. I love the Old Testament scripture that says those that wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. They'll run and not grow weary. They'll walk and not faint. You see, there's so much that will happen to you that is honestly too much for you, but it's never too much for God. You're going to face situations that are completely overwhelming, but I want you to know that God himself is not on his heels, right? And so when you reach that point where you're finally out of moves to make, here's the cool thing. You'll finally be still enough to ask God to move, and then still be still enough to see him when he does. You see, you'll run out of ideas, so you'll finally be looking past yourself for the solution. You'll have no useful ability to address it, and so you'll finally be open and desperate for intervention. In the first service, I shared this, and so I'll share it again. But if you go back to the Old Testament, so often God delivered the Israelites from perilous situations, being overrun by foreign enemies and the like. But he always did it with a force so much smaller than their enemies. And so he rallied a guy named Gideon to lead them to overthrow an army that was like the sands of the seashore. It was hundreds of thousands, and there was just thousands of Israelites. And God told Gideon, you've got too many soldiers. Go get rid of a bunch of them. Send them home. He's like, what? We're already outnumbered. He sent them. And then they still had too many. He said, no, send those home too. And it got down to where there was just 300 soldiers. And God explained himself to Gideon. He said, listen, even with a smaller force, if you guys would have won, you would have reasoned to yourself that we did it. We came through. So I want you to be very clear that you had absolutely no chance of doing this on your own. It was only God. And so it's not that he's punishing you and making you wait. He wants you to learn the most valuable lesson in the world. That even beyond the end of yourself, that's when he kicks in. You see, if he kicked in too soon, you would think it was you. You would think, yeah, it was that last-ditch effort I had. It was that call I made. It was that text I sent. It was that thing I tried. It was this. It was that. But by waiting till you're at the end of yourself, you know it's the God who raises the dead. You see, from that point, if you'll look to God, if you'll wait, he will act on your behalf. And your experience will be like what Paul described. It'll feel like, man, I was dead, but he raised me from the dead. The God who raises, I was dead emotionally, but God brought something too. We were dead in our marriage. There was no hope, but God brought a new day. We were sunk financially. We had no idea what we were going to do, but God raised the dead. That's what he's saying. And so here's the thing, guys. Once you have walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side, there just isn't much left that can shake you after that. Like once you've gone through the worst there is to go through and come out the other side, there isn't much left that can scare you anymore. I used to joke with people because I lived in the city and I went to a rough high school and stuff. And when I would talk to kids at church, I went to church in the suburbs, lived in the city. And sometimes people who didn't live in the city would say like, aren't you afraid to be out in the neighborhood at night? And I would joke and I would tell people, no, I'm actually the person that everyone else is afraid of. So I'm not, right? And so like it was obviously as a joke, but that's what happens when you are that person. There's nothing left to scare you. When you've seen the worst there is to see, there's nothing left to scare you. And that's what Paul said. He delivered us from deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. So our hope is now with him. Guys, once you let go that first time and that belay catches you, and you go, it works. that moment changes how you climb those walls after that, right? Before then, I had to be sure that everything I reached for, I could do. Oh, I can't reach that rock, I'm not going to it. I can't make this up, I can't do it. But once that auto belay kicked in and I actually finally was able to put my trust in it, then I'm like, I bet I can jump to that ledge over there. You don't make it, but it catches you, right? And that's how it works. Like once that thing kicks in the first time, all of a sudden you have a confidence, you have a freedom because you know it doesn't all depend on me. I'm not the one keeping me from hitting the ground. You see, that's what Paul was saying here. And once you go through this, you recognize when you see God kick in, you're not the one that stands between you and the worst. That's God. And I just want to be clear, 2 Corinthians 12:9, it's God talking, and he says, my strength is made perfect in human weakness. You see, that's where his ability comes into its own, when ours ends. As you'll never fully see God kick in until the point at which you cut out. You see, when you finally reach the end of yourself and all that's left is him, you realize he's always been enough anyway. You get through it and you worry about, if this happens, if that happens, this is still okay now, but if this happens, that's going to be... And when all of that comes and goes and all you're left with is him, you realize this is all I needed to begin with. Last thought. Once we meet him there, we can share him with others. And that's what Paul said. He said, we can comfort others with the comfort we ourselves received. You see, you are God's plan for the people around you. God meets us in our struggle. He meets us in our pain, and he brings comfort to us there. We get past that point where we thought, I couldn't go any further, and then God meets us and we do that. And then his whole plan is that everything we receive from him in that process, we then share with others. That's how it works. And so maybe you're here this morning and you're like in it. Man, it's so crucial. That's why the body of Christ is so crucial. The people around you are so crucial. That's why, when we get back to life as usual, that's why we have house parties. That's why we have small groups. That's why we do all those things, because you need the people around you, because God has deposited comfort and hope in them that doesn't wear out after one use. That's the beauty. Paul said, we comfort others with the same comfort we ourselves received, right? It's still usable even after the first application. In fact, what I've found is I'm far more comforted when I talk to another person who's already walked through the valley that I'm walking through. How many of you guys have noticed that? And you're like, man, I didn't know how I was going to navigate this. And then you talk to someone that navigated it, that God walked them through it, and God was enough for them. And you go, oh. And then that person becomes this huge source of comfort and hope. And so I want to challenge you in the middle of all this. There's a lot of things we can't do still, but man, you can make a phone call. You can message people. You can check on people and just, hey, how are you doing? I know there's a lot going on right now. I just want to see how you're doing. And the truth is, the amazing thing is that all of us have already seen a great number of things in our own life. And so stop and take inventory. What are the ways that God has met me in my own struggles, in my own hardship? And recognize that what that is a deposit of his comfort in you that he's now gifted you to be able to share with others so you can reach out. Like maybe you've been through a divorce and you know how hard it was. And even though it felt like life couldn't go on, here you are today. And God's restored you. And you've got a good life. And you look back and you go, man, I wouldn't want it any other way. Guess what? There's people sitting around you right now, maybe 6 feet from you, that are at that point that they don't know how life is going to go on and they're bewildered. Maybe you walked through a season of cancer and here you are on the other side and God's been faithful. Guess what? There's people maybe 6 feet from you that feel like they just got a death sentence. And they need someone to walk with them through it. Maybe you've seen financial ups and downs. You've been fired. You've been put out and everything else, right? There's people right now who are experiencing that for the first time. And they need you to walk through it with them. They need the comfort from you that you yourself received from God. The body is such a valuable thing. I'm so glad that it just worked out this way. This is the message that we're sharing today as we get to gather together for the first time. There's so much of the grace and the goodness of God that He's already established in your heart. And the thing is that you don't even, and that's graduation day. When you walk through the hardest things in life, you develop a depth and a connection to your God that cannot be forged any other way. That's when you grow. That's when you get reality. That's when you get roots. That's when you see His power in ways you've never seen it. That's when you get to know Him in ways you've never known Him. But I want to be real. Those are tough waters to swim. That's a tough path to walk. And it's all worth it in the end. But it's tough. And that's why He gives us guides to walk through it with us. So this week, man, consider all the ways that you get to be a guide. You've already paid the fare, right? You did the hurting. You did the walking. You've paid the fare to be a guide. Be a guide. And then look at the areas that you're bewildered right now. Look at the areas that you're up against it. And know that there's guides around you. Make a phone call, man. Shoot a text. And get the provision that God has already poured out in the people around you. I'm going to pray. We're going to sing one last song together. I challenge you during that song time, man, sing, celebrate with us, but ask God to highlight areas, man. Ask Him to highlight areas that He's already deposited that in you. Maybe you're here today and you've never put your trust in Jesus. And this is the coolest thing that's ever happened in all the world. All of us are broken and sinful. Me included, probably me especially, right? We blow it. God has a standard that we do not meet. But Jesus, God's own Son, came as a man to meet the standard in your place and in my place. And then He died a death on the cross that our sin deserves. Right? And so by putting our faith in Jesus, the Bible says, our sin gets punished in Jesus. And now we can receive the righteous life that He lived by faith. That means that from now on, when you put your trust in Jesus, God looks at you through the lens of Jesus' righteousness. That means when He looks at you, He's not going like this. He's embracing. So it starts by simply putting your trust. You repent of being your own God, and you say, man, I'm going to put my trust in Jesus. I'm going to accept His forgiveness, and I'm going to begin to follow Him. And it starts that simply. So I know right now, some of you, both online and in person, you're making that decision to put your trust in Jesus. A whole new thing is starting in your life today. We're going to pray and we're going to sing, Father, thank you so much for this. And I know right now, some of us are putting our faith, our trust in you. I pray that you'd help us to feel what your word tells us is true, that if we're in Christ, we are a new creation. All the old is gone and everything is made new. We're no longer afraid of judgment because we're made right with you through Jesus. Help us to trust that, to live in that reality. We give you thanks. Amen. If you haven't already found it, you will. There's going to come a moment when your fingers begin to slip off those rocks. The good news is you're going to find that He's always been there to catch you all along. You haven't depended on yourself all along. And when you finally learn to cast your cares on Him and trust Him, it changes the way you climb from then on. Guys, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for joining us online.